The train wheels shrieked against frozen rails as the locomotive lurched to a halt somewhere in Alabama. Hauptsturmführer Ernst Krause stood rigid in the cattle car, his SS uniform filthy, but his bearings still military precise. Around him, 300 German prisoners huddled in the December cold, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Remember," Ernst said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of fear, "we die as soldiers of the Reich. They will try to break us, but we will show them what German discipline means." His pale blue eyes swept across the faces of men who had fought in France, North Africa, and Italy. "When those doors open, stand tall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Gefreiter Otto Beckmann, crouched near the back wall, watched Ernst's performance with the weary skepticism that 4 years of war had ground into his bones. He glanced at the boy next to him, Soldat Klaus Zimmermann, barely 19, shaking so badly his teeth chattered. "Easy," Otto whispered, placing a hand on Klaus's shoulder. "Whatever happens, stay close to me." "They're going to execute us," Klaus said, his voice breaking. "The Hauptsturmführer said." "The Hauptsturmführer says a lot of things." Otto kept his voice low. He'd kept a secret diary throughout the war, documenting things that contradicted what they'd been taught. The diary was gone now, but the doubts remained. The train doors scraped open with a metallic screech. Cold Alabama air rushed in. Ernst straightened, preparing himself for machine guns. Through the open doors, they saw American soldiers, but the men weren't pointing weapons. They were holding blankets. "Welcome to Camp Aliceville," one of the Americans called out in broken German. "Please exit the train in an orderly fashion. You will be processed, medically examined, and assigned quarters." Ernst's face went rigid with confusion. Otto felt something twist in his chest, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Klaus began trembling harder, this time from bewilderment rather than terror. "It's a trick," Ernst announced. "They want us docile before the execution." But the Americans were already helping prisoners down from the train, wrapping blankets around emaciated shoulders. Otto watched an American sergeant, a black man, which sent ripples of shock through the German ranks, direct traffic with calm efficiency. When a prisoner stumbled, the sergeant steadied him without hesitation. They shuffled forward, stepping down onto American soil. An American soldier thrust a blanket into Otto's hands. Wool, thick, warmer than anything he'd owned in years. Another handed him a tin cup of something hot. "Coffee," the American said in broken German. "Drink. Warm." Otto stared at the cup. Real coffee. He hadn't tasted real coffee since 1942. Beside him, Klaus accepted his own cup with shaking hands and took a tentative sip. The boy's face crumpled, and he began to weep openly. From his office window in the camp's administration building, Colonel James Patterson watched the prisoners arrive. At 45, he'd seen enough of war to last several lifetimes. The Argonne Forest in 1918 had shown him what gas could do to men. He'd volunteered again in 1942, leaving his teaching position, because he believed some things were worth fighting for. Now he watched enemy soldiers shuffle into his camp and felt his Christian convictions battle against his very human anger. These men had worn the uniform of evil. His hand tightened on his coffee mug. "They look half-starved," said Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from behind him. At 26, she wore her Red Cross uniform with quiet competence. Her German was fluent. Her grandmother had emigrated from Munich in the 1920s. "Medical will need to examine all of them." "Do it," Patterson said. "Geneva Convention standards. By the book. Some of the staff think we're coddling them." Patterson turned to face her. "I don't care what the staff thinks. I care what's right. And I care what works. You want these boys to go home someday and tell their families that Americans are monsters? Or do you want them to go home confused about everything Hitler told them?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Psychological warfare. The best kind. The kind that doesn't require dropping bombs." Patterson returned his attention to the window. "Get them fed. Chicken soup, something their stomachs can handle. And Sarah, make sure they understand this isn't temporary kindness. This is how it's going to be." The processing took hours. Sergeant Marcus Washington supervised one of the stations, maintaining his professional composure even as prisoners reacted to his presence with everything from shock to outright hostility. At 28, Washington had learned to carry his dignity like armor. He'd volunteered despite facing segregation in his own army, because someone had to prove that Black Americans deserved better. "Name," he said in careful German to the next prisoner. Otto Beckman stepped forward. He'd been watching this sergeant all afternoon, noting the man's competence, his education evident in his bearing. Everything about Washington contradicted what Otto had been taught about racial hierarchies. "Beckman, Otto. Gefreiter. Wehrmacht," Otto recited. Then he added in halting English, "Your German is good." Washington's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Thank you. Your English is better than my German. Why are you treating us with kindness?" Otto asked. Washington hesitated. Behind Otto, more prisoners waited. But something in this German's face, genuine questioning rather than hostile challenge, made him answer honestly. Because that's what civilized people do, even to their enemies. By evening, all 300 prisoners had been processed and directed to barracks. The buildings were simple but solid, with working stoves, actual beds with mattresses, and blankets stacked neatly. Klaus stood in the middle of their assigned barracks, turning in slow circles. "This can't be real," he whispered. Ernst Krause had refused to cooperate and had been placed in isolation. Through his cell window, he could see into the barracks where his men were settling in. They had heat. They had real beds. The isolation cell was comfortable. That was what enraged him most. There was a cot, a blanket, a small stove. It wasn't punishment. It was accommodation. In the mess hall, dinner was served. Feldwebel Hans Vogel, who had volunteered for kitchen duty, nearly collapsed when he saw real butter. Fresh eggs. Flour that wasn't stretched with sawdust. When he touched the butter, he wept. The prisoners received bowls of chicken soup with actual chicken, fresh bread, real coffee. Klaus couldn't swallow his first spoonful. He sat staring at the soup while tears rolled down his face. Around him, hardened soldiers who'd survived the Afrika Korps broke down and cried over hot meals. Otto ate slowly, trying to process what was happening. Every assumption he'd carried was crumbling. The Americans weren't weak. They weren't cruel. They had resources that made Germany's wartime scarcity look medieval. That night, whispered conversations filled the barracks. "It's psychological warfare," one soldier insisted. "They're fattening us up before the real interrogations." "Maybe they're just following the Geneva Convention," another offered. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Maybe everything we were told was a lie," Otto said quietly. The barracks went silent. "We're already here. And from what I've seen today, this prison is better than home ever was." Ernst Krause, alone in his cell, stared at the ceiling and tried to hold on to his convictions. But the cell was warm, and his stomach was full for the first time in months, and his certainty was beginning to develop cracks he didn't know how to repair. Morning came with the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute that had become standard in Germany. Otto woke disoriented, then remembered, Alabama. American prison camp. Impossible kindness. Around him, other prisoners stirred. Klaus sat up looking bewildered. Down the barracks, older soldiers moved with cautious efficiency, men who'd learned not to trust good fortune. Formation in 10 minutes, an American guard called in German. Breakfast in the mess hall. Work assignments to follow. The mess hall was warm and filled with food smells. Otto joined the serving line and watched in disbelief as American cooks loaded his plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and coffee with real sugar available. Klaus looked like he might faint. Hans Vogel had positioned himself near the kitchen, and when the head cook asked for volunteers, Hans's hand shot up. Within minutes, he'd talked his way into actual kitchen duty. He stood amid ingredients he'd only dreamed about for years. "This is real butter," he said to the American cook, a man named Johnson. "Sure is," Johnson replied. "You want to help with lunch? We're doing pot roast." Hans didn't understand the English words, but he understood the invitation. He nodded enthusiastically, already cataloging ingredients. Real beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh herbs. His hands trembled as he began washing vegetables, and when Johnson handed him a potato peeler, Hans wept quietly while he worked. Work assignments were distributed strategically. Otto was assigned to maintenance detail, helping repair storm damage. He reported to a workstation where American soldiers were sorting tools and lumber. One of them, Corporal Davis, handed Otto a hammer. "You know construction?" Davis asked in broken German. Some. I worked on my family's farm. Otto accepted the hammer, noting its quality. They worked in comfortable silence, Otto following Davis's lead as they replaced damaged shingles. The American soldiers didn't guard him so much as work alongside him. Otto realized he could probably walk away if he wanted to. The thought made him dizzy. Where would he go? Why would he want to? Klaus had been assigned to help Private Chin with inventory. The two young men stood in a warehouse filled with supplies, crates of food, medical equipment, clothing, tools. Klaus felt his beliefs about American scarcity crumble. All this, he said in German, knowing Chin wouldn't understand but needing to say it. All this, and you're at war? Chin had been studying German. He caught enough words to understand. America is big, he said carefully in German. Many resources. Many factories. Klaus picked up a crate marking. Connecticut? Where is Connecticut? Chin pulled out a map of the United States and pointed. Klaus stared at the vast territory. Germany fit into one corner. His entire nation was smaller than some American states. The mathematics of the war suddenly became horrifyingly clear. In his isolation cell, Ernst Krause heard the camp coming to life. He'd refused breakfast, refused work assignment. But the cell remained comfortable. No one had beaten him. No one had raised their voice. A guard brought lunch on a tray, more food than he'd eaten in a day back in Germany. The guard set it down and left. Ernst stared at the meal. Sandwich on fresh bread, fruit, a cookie, milk. His stomach growled. He tried to maintain his hunger strike, but by mid-afternoon his body overruled his ideology. He ate the sandwich, then the fruit. Then, hating himself, the cookie. The food was delicious. That made it unbearable. Sergeant Washington made his rounds, observing prisoners at their assignments. He paused at the maintenance detail where Otto worked. Beckman, Washington called. Otto climbed down from the roof. Your work is good, Washington said in German. Thank you, Sergeant. Otto hesitated. May I ask you a question? You may ask. I may not answer. Yesterday, you said treating prisoners with kindness is what civilized people do. But in Germany, we were told Americans were the uncivilized ones. That people who look like me are inferior, Washington finished calmly. Yes, I know what you were taught. I'm beginning to think we were taught many lies, Otto said quietly. Washington studied him. That's a dangerous thought for a German soldier. I'm beginning to think being a German soldier was the dangerous part. Otto met his eyes. Everything here contradicts what we were told. And you're educated, competent, in command. None of that was supposed to be possible. It almost isn't possible, Washington said with unexpected honesty. Even in America, I face things you wouldn't understand. But the difference is that in America, I can fight for change. I can vote, protest, hope for better. Could you do that in Germany? Otto thought about the concentration camp photographs he'd glimpsed. The trains of civilians he'd seen and refused to ask about. His hidden diary and the fear that had kept him from writing the full truth. No, he said simply. We couldn't. In the education building, Sarah Mitchell was setting up for her first English class. She'd expected maybe a handful of attendees. Instead, over 50 prisoners showed up, crowding into the classroom with surprising eagerness. Klaus was among them, sitting in the front row with a notebook and pencil he gripped like a lifeline. Sarah began with basics, greetings, common phrases, vocabulary. But between language lessons, she wove in information about American culture and values. She showed them the Constitution, explaining that it was a document that limited government power. Several prisoners laughed, assuming she was joking. Others, like Otto who'd quietly joined, sat very still, thinking dangerous thoughts about what government was supposed to be. At lunch, the mess hall buzzed with conversation. Hans had convinced Johnson to let him help prepare the meal, adding German touches to the American pot roast. When prisoners complimented the food, Hans beamed. It's the butter, he explained. And the beef, real beef. And they let me use as much as the recipe needed. No rationing, no substitutes, just cooking. Real cooking. Colonel Patterson observed from the entrance, noting the interactions, the gradual relaxation in postures, the way prisoners had begun to treat the mess hall as comfortable rather than suspicious. It was working. The transformation was beginning. Sir, Lieutenant Mitchell approached. We need to talk about Hauptsturmführer Krause. He's refusing everything. Is he eating? Eventually. But he's fighting it. Patterson considered this. Ernst Krause represented the hardest case. a true believer whose indoctrination ran deep. Breaking through would require undermining the foundations of his worldview, piece by piece. Leave him be for now, Patterson decided. Let him watch. Let him see his men adapting, beginning to question. Sometimes the hardest part of maintaining your convictions is watching everyone else abandon theirs. That evening, Otto approached Washington again. Why did you join the American Army? Given how you're treated, why fight for a country that discriminates against you? Washington looked out across the camp, at the American flag flying above the administration building. Because it's my country. With all its flaws, all its failures, all its broken promises, it's still mine. And the only way to make it better is to be part of it, to serve it, to prove that men who look like me deserve everything other Americans have. I fight because I love my country enough to demand it become what it claims to be. Otto absorbed this. I think I never loved my country. I was just afraid of it. Washington looked at him sharply. That was sedition. But here in Camp Aliceville, it was just truth spoken quietly between two men who understood complicated loyalty. Then maybe you should figure out what kind of Germany you could love. Because someday you'll go home, and you'll have to decide what to do with what you've learned here. In his cell, Ernst heard the sounds of the camp settling. Laughter from the barracks. German soldiers laughing. Guards calling goodnight to prisoners in fractured German. The whole thing was obscene, this fraternization between victors and vanquished. Through his window, he could see his men walking freely, chatting with guards, looking relaxed. They were forgetting. They were betraying everything they'd fought for. And Ernst didn't know how to stop it, because the Americans wouldn't give him anything to fight against except their persistent, inexplicable decency. He turned away, lay down on his comfortable bed, and tried to hold on to his convictions. But they were beginning to feel like sand slipping through his fingers. And that terrified him more than any torture could have. The announcement came during morning formation. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the camp would celebrate with a traditional feast. The German prisoners didn't understand what this meant. Thanksgiving wasn't a holiday they knew, and celebrating anything in a prison camp seemed absurd. Sarah Mitchell had proposed the feast to Colonel Patterson days earlier, standing in his office with her jaw set in determination. It's controversial, Patterson had acknowledged. Everything about this camp is controversial, Sarah countered. But if we're trying to show them what American values look like, what better way than Thanksgiving? The whole point is gratitude, abundance, and coming together despite differences. Patterson had approved it, though he knew about the objections. Several guards had expressed discomfort with celebrating with Nazi prisoners. In town, rumors were spreading about the coddling happening at Camp Aliceville. But Patterson had commanded men in the Argonne Forest, had watched his best friend die from mustard gas, and he'd be damned if anyone told him mercy was weakness. The preparation forced unprecedented interaction. Hans Vogel practically vibrated with excitement when he learned he'd helped prepare the feast. He'd been working in the kitchen for a week, and Johnson had been teaching him American recipes in exchange for German baking techniques. They communicated in broken language and the universal tongue of cooking. Turkey, Johnson explained, showing Hans the massive birds. Traditional Thanksgiving turkey, 20 pounds each. Hans stared with religious awe. 20 pounds of meat, each. There would be dozens, enough to feed the entire camp with leftovers. In Germany, a chicken was a luxury. How do you prepare? He asked in his improving English. Johnson explained brining, stuffing, roasting. Hans took notes in German, his hands shaking. Then he asked hesitantly, "May I show you German recipe? For the bread?" "Sure thing. Always wanted to try that German bread." "What's it called?" "Stollen. Christmas bread. Very special. Need good butter, good flour, fruits, nuts." He paused. In Germany, we had none of these things. Was only memory. But here, he gestured at the abundant pantry. Here, I can make it real. The morning before Thanksgiving, civilians arrived at the camp gates. Patterson met them personally, recognizing the woman at the front, Eleanor Hawkins, whose son had died at Normandy. She carried a box of homemade items, and behind her stood a dozen other women from local churches. "Colonel," Mrs. Hawkins said steadily despite the pain in her eyes, "our pastor suggested we bring care packages for the prisoners. I thought he was crazy at first. I spent 3 months hating every German who ever lived after we got the telegram about Bobby. You don't have to do this, ma'am." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She looked past him. Chaplain Hayes helped me understand that those boys in there are somebody's sons too. That hating them won't bring Bobby back. And maybe, if they go home with a different understanding of Americans, Bobby's death might mean something beyond the grief. Patterson felt something catch in his throat. They'll appreciate it, ma'am. More than you know. The women distributed their packages. Cookies, scarves, cigarettes, toiletries. Humble items representing hours of work and enormous emotional labor. The prisoners accepted them with confused gratitude. Mrs. Hawkins found Otto by chance. He was arranging tables when she approached, holding out a package wrapped in simple paper. "For you," she said. Sarah appeared to translate. She made cookies. Homemade. Otto accepted the package carefully. "Thank you," he managed in English. Then, through Sarah, "Why?" Mrs. Hawkins looked at him for a long moment. She saw a young man, thin, tired, with old eyes. Not so different from Bobby. "My son died at Normandy," she said, and Sarah translated. "He was 23. His name was Robert, but we called him Bobby. He wanted to be a teacher." Otto felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd worn the same uniform as the men who'd killed this woman's son. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it intensely. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "I know you are." Mrs. Hawkins gently touched his arm. "I know you probably did things you're not proud of. We all do in war. But you're here now, and you're alive, and Bobby isn't. So I'm asking you something." Tears glistened in her eyes. "Be better than the men who killed my boy. Go home someday and be different. Make something good out of all this terrible waste." Otto couldn't speak. He simply nodded, clutching the cookies, feeling this woman's forgiveness like a physical burden that was somehow also a gift. Throughout the camp, similar interactions occurred. Klaus received a care package and broke down crying. Hans received cigarettes and a card Sarah translated. "Thank you for the wonderful food." Even hardened veterans found themselves undone by these small acts of civilian mercy. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and bright. The mess hall had been transformed, decorated with fall leaves and handmade decorations prisoners had helped create. The tables were set with tablecloths, real dishes, proper silverware. Hans and Johnson had outdone themselves. Turkey, dozens perfectly roasted. Mashed potatoes made with real butter and cream. Stuffing Hans had enhanced with German herbs. Green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls, and dessert, pumpkin pie, apple pie, and Hans's stollen made with real butter and fruits for the first time since he could remember. The prisoners filed in, their expressions showing everything from wonder to disbelief to guilt at this abundance, while their families starved. They found their seats, looking at plates being loaded with more food than most had seen in years. Patterson stood at the front. "Today is Thanksgiving," he said in German, Sarah translating where needed. "It's an American holiday where we express gratitude for our blessings and share what we have with others. I know many of you are confused. Some think it's a trick. It's not. This is what Americans do. We celebrate together. We share abundance. We give thanks even in difficult times." He paused. "You are prisoners of war, yes. But you are also human beings. You're somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's father. And today, you're our guests. So please, eat, enjoy, and maybe think about what kind of world we could build if we treated each other with dignity instead of hatred." Chaplain Hayes gave the blessing in both languages. "We give thanks for this food, for this fellowship, and for the possibility of peace. May we remember that we are all children of God, and that every life has value. Amen." The meal began. Klaus took his first bite of turkey and couldn't continue. The abundance, the impossible kindness overwhelmed him completely. Chin sat beside him, gently encouraging him to eat. Otto sat with Washington and several others, eating slowly. Washington explained the history, pilgrims, survival, gratitude for harvest. "So it's about being thankful even when times are hard?" Otto asked. "Exactly. About recognizing what you have instead of only mourning what you've lost." Otto looked at his laden plate. He thought about Mrs. Hawkins, who'd lost her son but still baked cookies for enemy soldiers. "I think this is the most subversive thing you could have done to us." Washington raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Because you can't hate people who feed you like this. You can't maintain ideology when reality keeps contradicting it. Every bite of this food is evidence that we were lied to. About American weakness, democratic inefficiency, racial hierarchies, everything. You're not trying to break us with cruelty. You're breaking us with kindness. It's brilliant and devastating, and I don't know how to fight it. Maybe, Washington suggested gently, you're not supposed to fight it. Maybe you're supposed to let it change you. Hans emerged with his stolen. He presented it with tearful pride, and when prisoners tasted it, tasted home, tasted memory, tasted what their heritage could be with actual resources, several more men wept. Only Ernst remained absent, sitting in his cell, refusing to participate. But through his window, he could see into the mess hall. He could see German soldiers sharing tables with American captors, laughing, passing dishes like they were breaking bread with friends instead of enemies. He could see Klaus accepting seconds from Chun with a shy smile. Hans in the kitchen doorway, beaming. Otto engaged in serious conversation with Washington, treating the man as an equal. Ernst's worldview required these Americans to be inferior, their kindness to be weakness. But the evidence told a different story. These Americans were competent, organized, wealthy beyond anything Germany had achieved. Their racial diversity strengthened them. Their democratic chaos somehow produced better results than German authoritarian efficiency. He turned away, but couldn't escape the smell, the sound of laughter, the undeniable reality that everything he'd built his life on was crumbling. His stomach growled. He'd been brought a plate. Turkey, all the sides, even pie. And it sat on his table, cooling but still abundant. Ernst Krause stared at that plate of American food and felt something break inside him. Not surrender, not yet. But the first tiny crack in the foundation, the first whisper of doubt that maybe he'd dedicated his life to lies. In the mess hall, the feast continued. As prisoners began helping clear dishes, voluntarily, without being ordered, Patterson caught Sarah's eye. She smiled, tired but satisfied. They'd proven that mercy wasn't weakness, that abundance shared was abundance multiplied, that the best weapon against hatred was the stubborn refusal to return it in kind. Klaus approached Chun. Tommy, he said, using the American's first name for the first time. What Thanksgiving mean? Really mean? Chun thought for a moment. It means being grateful, being together, sharing what you have, even with people who are different from you, even with enemies, maybe especially with enemies. Because if you share food with someone, break bread together, it's hard to keep thinking of them as enemies. Klaus nodded slowly, processing. Then he said something in German that Chun couldn't understand. Sarah translated. He says that in Germany, they taught him to hate before they taught him to question. But here, you're teaching him to question. And he thinks maybe questioning is more important than anything else he learned. Chun looked at Klaus with new respect. Tell him he's going to be okay. Tell him questioning is how you become wise instead of just obedient. As Sarah translated, Klaus's eyes filled with tears, but this time he smiled through them. He'd spent his entire life being told what to think. Now, in an enemy prison camp, he was finally learning to think for himself. Outside, the Alabama sun set. Inside, German prisoners and American soldiers continued cleaning together, occasionally laughing at some shared moment of understanding that transcended language and nationality. In his office, Patterson wrote his report, Thanksgiving celebration successful beyond expectations. Evidence of significant ideological transformation among majority of prisoners. The psychological warfare of generosity appears more effective than any conventional interrogation methods could be. In his cell, Ernst finally picked up his fork and began eating his cold Thanksgiving dinner. Each bite tasted like surrender, like betrayal, like the death of everything he'd believed in. But his body didn't care about ideology. His body just knew that this food was good, that this abundance was real, and that perhaps he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything that mattered. As night fell, 300 German soldiers went to sleep with full stomachs and troubled minds, carrying too many uncomfortable truths to ignore any longer. The psychological warfare continued, one act of kindness at a time, one shared meal at a time, one moment of recognition that enemies were just people who'd been taught to hate each other. And in the quiet darkness, Ernst lay awake, feeling the certainty he'd carried for 9 years begin to crumble, wondering who he would be when it was finally completely gone. Post-Thanksgiving, prisoners began working outside camp on local farms. Otto found himself operating machinery worth more than his entire village owned. Tractors that plowed fields in hours rather than days. Mechanical harvesters that did the work of 50 men. The American farmer who owned the equipment treated it casually, mentioning he'd upgrade next season. Klaus accompanied Chun on supply runs to nearby towns, witnessing integrated communities functioning peacefully. Children of different backgrounds played together. Shops served everyone. The contradiction between Nazi propaganda and observable reality became impossible to ignore. American newspapers showing concentration camp liberation photographs forced moral reckoning. Prisoners could no longer deny the Holocaust. Heated debates erupted, with Ernst defending the Reich while Otto accepted German guilt. A winter storm exposed American segregation when black soldiers were refused shelter while German prisoners were welcomed, teaching prisoners about imperfection versus evil in political systems. Letter writing brought devastating news from home: bombed villages, destroyed homes, starving families. The contrast between their improving conditions and Germany's destruction created unbearable survivor's guilt. Ernst's isolation deepened as other prisoners openly discussed their transformation. Christmas Eve service became the emotional climax. Klaus broke down confessing his participation in evil. Otto spoke about collective responsibility. Ernst finally shattered completely, privately telling Chaplain Hayes, "We were lied to about everything." Patterson's young son shared Christmas candy with Klaus, an act of innocent generosity that completed the young soldier's transformation. Early 1946 brought redemption through action. Prisoners volunteered extra labor as penance. Ernst apologized personally to Mrs. Hawkins. Klaus taught democratic principles to other young prisoners. Hans cooked for community events, using food as reconciliation. Germany's surrender in May 1945 and full Holocaust documentation forced final confrontation with their nation's evil. The prisoners prepared for repatriation, carrying uncomfortable truths home. September 1946 brought farewell. Ernst thanked Patterson for showing them what we should have been. They boarded ships as transformed men, committed to rebuilding Germany differently. The epilogue revealed their impact. Otto became a teacher educating about democracy. Klaus wrote a memoir. Ernst worked in social services. Hans reopened his bakery. Otto's final lesson to students: kindness is more powerful than cruelty, proving that radical compassion could defeat hatred more effectively than punishment ever could. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.